Joining me right now is my friend Rachel Kleinfeld. Rachel is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, but right now she's also a member of this task force on National Task Force on Election Crises, which sounds ominous, but I think we're in a moment of time where we all have to be prepared for any eventuality. Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Jamal.
All right. So we saw this week that's been concerning the governor of Texas preparing to calling out the National Guard. They say in Texas that it's not because of the election. It's got to do with general unrest, but it's happening the week before Election Day. We also saw, Homeland Security and ICE is on standby. We know the CBP, the Border Patrol, has been preparing for unrest. In Washington, D.C. right now, we've got stores that are boarding up, in Washington downtown because they're concerned about unrest. Can you just tell me what could be the role of the military this week going into Election Day? What's legally possible?
Sure. So let me separate out. There's a bunch of categories going on here that I think, unfortunately, the timing is conflating together.
Okay.
So the National Guard is the force that a governor would call if they feel that they need some extra help because there are too many people on the street and they need to keep them separated. The most likely source of violence in our country are protesters and counter-protesters getting too close together because passions are so high right now. And so it's a totally legitimate thing to want to separate those groups, keep them separate, create space. And so what you're seeing is that occurring in Philadelphia, where the governor has just called up the Guard because there was looting last night, because there was some unrest last night. And usually what the Guard does is fill in for law enforcement. So the Guard is not generally the first force on the street. That's local law enforcement, and the Guard fills in their jobs so that local law enforcement is freed up to do those jobs. However, frankly, for myself, in many places, I would rather be patrolled by a guardsman because the guardsmen and women are trained in civil unrest. They're trained in how to de-escalate, how to deal with these things, whereas your local law enforcement may or may not have any experience with this. In Texas, it looks like what has happened was a poor news report. That we know that in states all over the country, the Guard has been training with local law enforcement for post-election civil unrest. That is not surprising, given that stores are boarding up in DC, given that my own friends are asking me, knowing that I work on this, they're saying, should I stockpile food? Should I move to our house in the mountains or by the lake for that week, after voting? And everybody is scared. In fact, if you look at the polls by groups like More in Common that work on anti-polarization, 71% of Americans fear post-election violence. So totally normal that the Guard would train for that and would train with local law enforcement. And unfortunately, the confluence of potentially significant protests around police violence, the kind that we saw all summer, but a spike right now, at the same time as Election Day, might put these two forces together. And that's too bad. The optics are going to be bad if that happens. You don't want to see a bunch of National Guard on your streets when it's Election Day. But I think voters can just take a breath and recognize that that doesn't necessarily mean anything unlawful or bad is happening. It's just we're having protests and they're intense.
Okay, so these particular stories seem like they are happening for legitimate reasons, law enforcement reasons that are normally under the purview of the National Guard. Is there a possibility, though, for those of us who are more, conspiracy minded or more worried, is there a possibility for the President of the United States to call up the National Guard or federalize the National Guard, I guess is the proper term, in any way during the election?
Yeah, so there are ways that the president could attempt to sow doubt in people's minds, just like he's been doing all summer with these calls of fraud. It's harder than people think. So the trump card, apologize for the wording, that the president can use is the Insurrection Act. And if the president calls the Insurrection Act, it's a huge deal. It's not a normal thing for a president to do. The Insurrection Act was used to force states to abide by civil rights legislation in the 60s and 50s. And that's how it's most known now. It was used when the governor of California asked for it in 92 to deal with the LA riots. It was also used a whole lot of times during union and labor unrest in the early 1900s to put down those incidents. So it has a very mixed legacy, and it's not a normal thing. And I think that's why you saw Milley and Esper and our other military and civilian leaders of the military coming out so strongly against it over this summer. But if the president wanted to, he can call out the Insurrection Act. And what that allows him to do is use federal active duty troops to enforce law, to engage in law enforcement around the country. And if he federalized the National Guard, so if he called the National Guard up under Title X, he could do the same thing. And that's kind of an end game, but it's not entirely in the president's purview. The president can call up these troops, but if they act in ways that intimidate anyone during the election, or even give the optics of intimidation, or affect the ballot and the count, that's subject to judicial review. Judges can say, look, the president has the power to call them up. He doesn't have the power to tell them to interfere in an election. In fact, that's absolutely illegal. There's a whole host of laws that govern that.
Okay, so let's get something that's probably a little closer to home for some people. Texas is an example. The governor of Texas is a Republican. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris is going to Texas. Joe Biden is contesting the state. It's possible there's a Senate race on the books there too. It's possible that Democrats could possibly take Texas. What would happen? Could the governor of Texas send National Guard troops to voting centers, to election locations, to safeguard the vote or to ensure peace at voting locations?
So first, I would say, if you are on the protesting side of things, it would behoove you to stay away from the polls, because not only is it illegal to be too close to a poll and affect the election outcome or intimidate people, but it can invite the ability for law enforcement to go in. It doesn't have to be the Guard. It can also be local law enforcement who go in. And most states have laws against that, including Texas, about law enforcement or armed federal agents or armed state agents getting too close to the polls. However, they can enforce order. And so if there's disorder, it gives them an excuse. So I would say, to the extent that it's possible to stay away from polling locations, that's very, very good. Now, even though they can enforce order, they can't intimidate voters, nor can they affect the outcome of the election. And there's a whole slew of laws at the federal and state level that govern that sort of thing. The governor of Texas would have to abide by the civil rights laws that at a federal level keep troops from doing that, even if they're National Guard.
So if for some reason there were guardsmen women sent to an election location, what would be the response? How could you stop it? Would that be a lawsuit that would have to be filed by some party that claims injury to get those troops removed? Like on election day, like this, it doesn't matter if it's a week later that the court rules, right? On election day, how would you stop this?
So first, I should have said this earlier. Let me distinguish between two kinds of poll. So during the primaries, a couple of states, Kentucky, New Jersey, who were overwhelmed during the primaries, asked their guardsmen to come and man polls, direct traffic, in one case, count ballots. And the National Guard Bureau said, that's okay, but they have to be not in uniform, not carrying arms. They basically have to look like any other volunteer who would show up to do those things, potentially slightly better looking and more muscular, but otherwise like any other volunteer at the polls. And the Guard was allowed to do that. Showing up uniformed in with arms is a different thing. And even if they were deployed lawfully, they'd still have to follow the laws that prohibit government and private actors from engaging in conspiracies and so on. The Civil Rights Act, 18 U.S.C. 594, which makes voter intimidation a federal crime subject to imprisonment. How does that get enforced? An election official could call local law enforcement and say, hey, I'm feeling intimidated. An individual could call the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. They've got a hotline and say, hey, I'm feeling intimidated by this action. And those groups have already prepared temporary restraining orders and so on against this kind of activity. They would rush them to a local judge and try to get the temporary restraining order to be acted on and enforced. But usually it doesn't need to go all the way to that stage. Election officials have a great deal of discretion at polling locations to say, stand back, you have to be 100 feet away. And generally, these things can be worked out with the election official retaining control of the space under their basically their peripheral space.
Yeah, I just come from, I did a lot of politics in the South, and I do remember, sheriffs and armed police sitting on roadsides with shotguns in their laps, as voters were trying to come in and vote, and that being an intimidating factor in some places.
And that's the worst case scenario. I mean, the worst case scenario here, and it might happen in some places, is where different levels of law enforcement face off, right? Where you have one level of law enforcement trying to keep voters unintimidated and another trying to intimidate. And that's difficult to resolve, frankly, and hopefully won't happen in many places.
All right. So as we close up, what's your sort of closing thought about this moment that we're seeing a lot of things that are happening, but don't trip your wires that we're approaching a crisis, or are you having are your caution flags being raised at all?
Both. I think I've been working 2 years with various groups to make sure that America's political violence is kept down, and for the last couple of months, myself and a whole slew of groups, public actors, private actors, over 1,000 community resilience groups inside communities, data groups that are scouring the web for any hint of violence. Some of them working with the FBI, which is how plots like the plot against Governor Whitmer got thoroughly infiltrated. This has all been going on to make sure this election is safe and secure. The National Guard actually is doing cybersecurity for most states for the same reason. And so obviously, this is a fraught election. This is an election in which tempers are high. The president is not helping matters. The pandemic is not helping matters. We're all cooped up, and everyone is pretty anxious and upset. And given all that and all the protests this summer since June, we've actually had very little violence. And so it's worth remembering that with this huge spike of protest in June, pretty significant level of protest over the summer, really high tempers, a lot of politicized partisan activity. It hasn't been perfect, but violence has been much lower than one could expect. Very few of the protests became violent on either side. And I'm hopeful that we can get through the election in the same way, and that we can then try to take the temperature down in our society in a number of ways so that we can come out of this ahead of the game later on.